Now, China is a lender to the United States government. China and Japan are the number 1 and 2 lenders to the US government. China has been demanding repayment in dollars. It has been reducing its holdings of US debt by hundreds of billions of dollars. The whole world. Economic growth is faster in the East than it is in the West. The G7 and the BRICS had the same total GDP in the year 2020. Now the BRICS have about 3 or 4% more than the G7. Capitalism has always had financial problems. The way the system works produces financial problems. Here in the United States, we have a governmental system that works as follows. On the one hand, you have corporations and the rich. They are a minority, but they provide the money for political parties. The political party, Republican and Democrat, spend an enormous amount of money. They buy time on television. Everything is done by mass media, by social media, and so forth. So for a candidate or a party to win, they need to get a lot of money. And that money comes overwhelmingly from corporations and the rich. And they don't want to be taxed. So what corporations and the rich want from the government is lots of service. They want 800 military bases, so that nobody will interfere with exports or imports or all of that. They want the government to help them, to educate workers so that they are productive, to all of that. Prisons, we have an enormous prison population, all of that. Then there are the mass of people, the working class, the employees. They too want services from the government. They want schools, they want hospitals, they want roads to be working, and so forth. And they don't want to pay taxes either. But they're not so powerful. They don't have any money to give the politicians, but they give them votes. And the politicians, once a year, need some votes. So we have the following capitalist system. Politicians, faced with the need to raise money from corporations and the rich, but without the power really to tax them. Because if you tax them, they won't give you the money. They'll give the money to somebody else who's running against you. You'll be out of there within the next year or two, and in will come somebody who plays the game. And likewise, you can't keep putting the taxes on the mass of people because they don't have enough. And they're going to rise up again. That's dangerous. Okay. So you have to provide services, but you can't tax. How do you handle that problem? And the way the capitalists have handled that problem in the West is by borrowing. Okay, if the government has to do all these things, but we dare not raise taxes on corporations and the rich or the mass of people, then we will borrow the money, because that way we can spend it on what people need, but without taxing them. It's just, and they will vote for us and they will give us money. And that's how it works. But the problem is you accumulate an enormous national debt, adding up each year's deficits between what the government spends and what it raises in taxes. The important thing to understand about this, though, which many people don't, is that this is very good for corporations and the rich for as long as it lasts. Why? Because when the government borrows, who does it borrow from? It borrows from corporations and the rich. Nobody else has money to lend to the government. So here what we have, the government lets corporations and the rich not pay taxes, and then comes back to them and says, lend the government the money that you didn't. For corporations and the rich, this is, of course, wonderful. Instead of paying taxes, say goodbye to your money, they get to give the government a loan, which the government will pay back plus interest on the loan. So for corporations and the rich, going ever deeper into debt is perfectly acceptable, which is why corporations and the rich are now permitting, here in the United States, we run deficits in the trillions of US dollars every year, like this year. And corporations and the rich, they worry only because at a certain point, when you borrow more and more, you run the risk that some of the lenders, the very corporations and the rich, will decide it is too risky. You are so in debt that there may be an uprising from the people which will say you cannot repay the debt. You have to take care of us first. Now, China is a lender to the United States government. China and Japan are the number 1 and 2 lenders to the US government. China has been reducing, demanding repayment in dollars. It has been reducing its holdings of US debt by hundreds of billions of dollars over the last few years. This is an important sign that in China, too, there's the beginning of the worry that the debts are going up so fast that you're getting closer to a crisis when the mass of people say, we will not continue to pay the taxes. You need to repay the debt, which you only got because you weren't willing to tax corporations and the rich. That's why in the United States, an enormous amount of time and energy is spent by leading economists to explain deficits and national debts in every conceivable way other than what I've just told you, because they don't want the mass of people to realize that a debt is simply postponing the burden of taxation on the employees in order to benefit the employers who get out of paying a tax and have a government loan instead. If the mass of people understood what I've just told you, then they would not allow this kind of deficit spending, and they would demand that taxes be raised on corporations and the rich because they have evaded their share of taxes for many years, and because they are the richest and therefore most able to pay to get out. But my guess is we're not going to solve this problem until it blows up. And if you ask me, when will it blow up? I can't answer that question, because that's a question really of when does capitalism run out of its mechanisms to stay in power? I think that capitalism is declining everywhere in the world, with the exceptions, perhaps, of Asia. The best way to understand these issues is to be historical in your approach. And the history of capitalism should be understood as the history of movement, of change, of relocation of capitalist industry, because that has been the reality from the beginning. If we date the origin of modern capitalism in England in the 17th and 18th century, then obviously we know the story of relocation, because England is now empty of most capitalist industry. It has left England and moved elsewhere. Initially, it moved from England to Western Europe. From Western Europe, it moved to the United States, to North America. It moved to Japan. And eventually it moved everywhere in the sense of colonialism and imperialism. There were the last 4 or 5 centuries have been basically the story of capitalism spreading, relocating. And I particularly want to focus on the center, the dynamic center of capitalism. Because, for example, even though capitalism relocated its center out of Britain, It still left capitalism in Britain, but it wasn't the dynamic growth center of capitalism. That has not been British for over a century at this point. We know where the center of capitalism went because we know that the British Empire declined in the 19th and 20th century, and the American empire rose, particularly in the 20th century, and it became the dominant, explosive growth center. And by that, I mean where GDP grows quickly, where huge numbers of people leave agriculture and move from rural to urban, move from farm work to industrial work. We can see where the dynamic center of capitalism has relocated. And now comes my important point, I think. Over the last 30, 40 years, we have seen the latest relocation of the dynamic center of capitalist industry and growth. It has left Western Europe, it has left North America, and it has left Japan. And it has gone, above all, to the People's Republic of China, but also to places like India and Brazil and other parts, Vietnam and other parts of the world. But it has left the old part. And that is how capitalism has always worked. It has always relocated following where profits were the greatest. And so, for example, here in the United States, many companies, many of our largest corporations over the last 40 years grew their enterprises in China or in India or in Brazil or in Vietnam. Wages were lower, India, China, and Brazil, and the economic market was growing faster than in Europe, North America, and Japan. And we are seeing the consequences for those that are able to see it, who are able to admit it, who are not blinded by their own ideology. And I have to tell you that in much of Europe and in much of North America, the major response to the relocation of capitalism to the East, mostly to the South and the East, has been what psychologists call denial. They haven't admitted it. Politicians have felt that what they must say to the people is that we are strong and we are powerful and we are what we were. This has happened before in history. It takes some time before the people living through the relocation of capitalism will finally be able to face it, to admit it, and to begin to deal with it. We're not there yet. And whether you look at the war in Ukraine, or you look at foreign policy of the West, or you look, for example, at the conflict around Taiwan in the South China Sea, you see a West that still thinks it has the dominant power. It doesn't. And the statistic I use to drive this point home to people is that if you look at the GDP, the gross domestic product, which measures the total output of goods and services in 1 year, if you look at the total GDP of the United States and its major allies, the G7, United States, Canada, Japan, Britain, France, Germany, and Italy, it is significantly less right now than the GDP of China and its allies in the BRICS, BRICA, that other new alliance. So that tells the whole world economic growth is faster in the East than it is in the West. The G7 and the BRICS had the same total GDP in the year 2020. Now the BRICS have about 3 or 4% more than the G7. And that shows you that the gap between them is getting larger. This is reshaping global capitalism and all world affairs. We are living through that, but I think the important thing is to realize that this is what's going on, to understand that every country in the world, your country, my country, all are now rethinking their foreign policies, their place in the world, the future of their industries, because the economic situation of the world economy is changing so dramatically.